Hello. Today we're going to talk about the basic fundamentals of writing a literary analysis. There are lots of different ways to approach a literary analysis. What we do here today is going to be not the only way, definitely. But I just want to give you kind of the basic kind of starter package for what to do with a literary analysis. First of all, it's important to know what a literary analysis is not. And if we look up here, literary analysis is not a plot summary. A lot of times when I get literary analysis papers, I'll get a whole lot of just retelling of the story, and that's not what a literary analysis is. It is not a review. It doesn't say anything about whether or not you like the story. What it is, though, is an analysis, a discussion of how the essential components of a piece of literature come together to achieve a particular effect for the audience. Okay, so I like to describe it as, being able to read a story is kind of like being able to drive a car. Being able to analyze a story is like being able to open up the hood of the car and explain what all the engine parts are and how they function together to make the car go. So I hope that analogy helps you understand a little bit about what the analysis is all about. It does reveal and discuss elements beyond the plot to give the reader a better, more thorough understanding of the story. So, as I mentioned before, it's beyond the plot. You can think of your audience as someone who's read the story but has not really thought beyond the plot level. They've seen it. It's good entertainment, or maybe it's not. They either like it or they don't like it. But maybe after you've explained some of the ideas, some of the more profound ideas in the story, somebody might have a better understanding and gain an appreciation for the story that they didn't have before, and they might change their mind. It may not be such a boring story after all. The last item here says it does delineate the story's significance as a true piece of literature or art, as opposed to a mere source of superficial entertainment. And again, a lot of people like to think of literature as entertainment, and it can be entertaining, and some literature is designed to be only entertaining, and that's okay. I like a good cheesy story, just for entertainment. But good literature really does function as a piece of art, does say something about, reflects something about our society, about where we are, where we've been, and where we plan to go. So let's move on ahead and take a look at the introduction part to a literary analysis. And again, there are multiple correct ways to do this, but this is a way that I like to suggest. Anytime we do a paper, I suggest starting out with some known information, some background information that your audience is likely to already be familiar with. So if you think of your audience as people who have read the story and understood the plot level but really haven't thought beyond that, then you can kind of give them some background or give like a 2 or 3 sentence plot summary of the story. Again, it's not a book report. You're not retelling the entire story. But if you can narrow the essence of that story down to 2 or 3 sentences at the beginning of your introduction, that's a good way to catch your reader where they belong, or where they are after having read the story. And then ultimately you start transitioning into some of the new information. So on the surface, the plot level, the story is, and the story we're going to talk about in this session has to do with William Faulkner's A Rose for Emily. So you would make sure you mention the author's name and also the name of the story in your introduction. So something like in William Faulkner's A Rose for Emily, and then you continue on from there. So you move on into the new information. So you start working towards the analysis. What will your audience learn beyond the plot? That's really what the analysis is all about. And then, of course, at the end, you have a thesis statement. And a thesis statement is the claim to be proven throughout the rest of the paper. You're not going to say everything there is to say about the story, but you want to choose a particular focus, and that focus should at least have one theme, and be careful about saying the theme of a story, because any good piece of literature will have more than one theme. and whatever approach you would like to take with the story. And we'll talk about multiple ways to do that as we progress through this. And don't forget that a paragraph, in my class anyway, a paragraph is somewhere between a third and a half a page long. That's a good, well-developed paragraph, and the introduction to your literary analysis is certainly, it qualifies as a paragraph. So that's about the length that I would expect. All right, let's move on. There's one other thing we have to be really careful about with the literary analysis before we dive too deeply into it, is that with each type of writing we do, each one presents its share of particular problems and nuances. And so one of the things that we run across with literary analysis is the verb tense combinations. A lot of people like to discuss stories in the past tense because they've finished reading the story, so to them it feels like the story is in the past tense. But if somebody's reading your literary analysis and you're discussing the events in the story as if they happened at some point in the past, it kind of seems like the story doesn't exist anymore. And as long as there's a single copy left of that story, then we need to discuss the events in the literature as if they are in the present tense. Every time you open up a copy of Julius Caesar, Antony and Brutus are going to have a debate. Not they had a debate, but they debate in the story. So here are a couple of examples. We want to make sure that Romeo, these are the wrong examples. Romeo committed suicide. Well, every time you open up a copy of Romeo and Juliet, he's going to do the same thing. So you would say Romeo commits suicide, not he committed suicide. And of course, from To Kill a Mockingbird, Atticus defended Tom Robinson. Nope, every time you open up that story, he defends Tom Robinson. Same thing with Jay Gatsby. Jay Gatsby, not that he wanted to marry Daisy, but when you read that story, he wants to marry her every time you read it. Now, if you're going to be discussing background, such as Jay Gatsby, wait a minute, Jay Gatsby doesn't work for Dan Cody in that story, does he? So in that case, since it's background information, you would say Jay Gatsby worked for Dan Cody. So it's really important to make sure you keep your verb tenses straight when you're discussing literature. So let's move on to, that's the introduction and some considerations you want to think about before you get into the body of the paper. But essentially with a literary analysis, just like any other paper, you want to start off with a topic sentence. You want to explain the concept you're going to be discussing in that particular paragraph. You want to provide, you want to do this in your own words, and you want to provide textual evidence. So 1 to 3 examples, and then of course that evidence could be a quote, it could be a paraphrase, could be an explanation, or a little bit of a plot summary of that one particular part. Now this is where plot summary does come into play. You're going to have to explain to your readers, at what point in the story something happens. So then, yes, you are giving a few plot details, but you're not giving, just a straight plot summary. And so each major point, and whether that major point encompasses 1 paragraph, 2 paragraphs, or 3 paragraphs, you want to organize it in this way. So you have a topic sentence. Don't forget the topic sentence. Explain the idea. Provide textual evidence, and you can give, depending on the point you're trying to make, it could be anywhere probably from 1 to 3 examples, and of course it could extend beyond that if your paper's considerably longer. And you want to finish up each major point by explaining how each example ties back to and supports the thesis statement or the thesis claim. That's a nice way to let people know you're finished with that particular idea. It ties your paper together, gives it unity, and so forth. And so you repeat that same process for every other major point you have in that paper. So 2, 3, 4, however many you have, that's what you want to do. And of course with the conclusion, just like with any conclusion, you reiterate and reinforce the thesis. You explain to readers what the big takeaway is from the analysis, how such an analysis might be applied maybe even to other literature, especially literature that is in the same genre, and we'll talk about how some of those apply to a A Rose for Emily and some other literature that falls into the Southern Gothic genre, and what readers can do with the information in the analysis. Okay, so send them off with some homework. All right, so one of the things we always want to do with literature is to discuss theme. And keep in mind that I know that people use the word theme in multiple ways, but in the true literary sense of a theme, this is the definition I like to work with, is a universal truth about human nature or human experience that's brought out through the literature. A theme really can't be explained or described in one or two words. You don't say, oh, death is a theme or love is a theme. Well, that might happen in the story. It might be a topic that happens in the story, but I wouldn't refer to that as a theme. So we'll take a look at some themes in just a little bit, but I want you to make sure you understand what a good, thorough understanding of theme is all about. And so a theme brings out a universal truth. And a universal truth means that the idea is true or potentially true for everyone, regardless of, and it's got all these demographic factors here. If basically anyone who is or has ever been a human being, it applies to those people, or it potentially applies to those people because it's part of the human experience. So let's move on and take a look at some of these themes and how we might work those into our analysis. And these are some themes from William Faulkner's A Rose for Emily. And so one theme is, keep in mind, a statement about human existence or human nature. Any society founded on systemic oppression and corruption is destined to fail and self-destruct. And so that's a single sentence theme, which nicely sums up a lot of what happens in A Rose for Emily. That system that we see depicted in A Rose for Emily is pretty much, slavery. We're talking about the Old South, how some people were able to live like royalty, just a handful of people, but only at the expense of millions of other people who had to give up their lives, give up their freedoms and their humanity so that other people could live this charmed life. And so this is kind of the essence of what happens with A Rose for Emily, is that Emily is a Southern belle. She's been raised to believe she's some kind of quasi-royalty. And then, slavery has been over for some time, because the story takes place around the 1930s, perhaps. So I wouldn't refer to any of the characters in the story, Toby in particular, as a slave. He's a servant, but he's technically not a slave. But Emily was raised to believe she was some kind of royalty, but then the money ran out, right? So the slaves are gone, the plantation life is all over. You can see it's been taken over by the cotton gins and the gas pumps and all the machinery and so forth of the modern life. And so Emily finds herself in a situation in which she's having to survive the best she can after all of that goes away. It's the only life she's ever known. And so we could follow that up with this second statement. The character of Emily Grierson exemplifies or symbolizes the dysfunction and decay that ultimately ensues from an unstable, corrupt society. So that sounds a little bit to me like a thesis statement. And you might say, you might make this your thesis statement and use the rest of your paper to prove and to back up that thesis statement. So another example says, people whose reality is threatened, changes dramatically, or ceases to exist must adapt or perish. Those who fail to adapt often find themselves clinging to the past and denying the progression of time. Okay, so this is something that happens in real life. It happens, it's a kind of a situation we're all faced with when we run across a situation in which our reality is changed. We have to learn to adapt, or bad things can happen. And of course, Emily, being the static character that she is, she fails to adapt to those changes, and she isolates herself. And that really is sort of the definition of a static character, is a character who fails to learn, grow, and change, who fails to overcome conflict. And static characters usually end up either isolated from society or dead, or in Emily's case, both. And so you could follow this up with something like this. Emily Grierson is such a static character. She fails to grow, learn, and change, choosing instead to isolate herself from the changing world beyond her dilapidated, anachronistic home. And then you can move on, and your whole paper could be all about how Emily exemplifies what a static character really is. All right, let's take a look at a third theme. Artificial social structures such as gender roles and stereotypes prevent people from reaching their full potential. Such social structures not only limit individuals but entire societies. Okay, so in this case, we're talking about how the story is kind of an example of what happens when artificial social structures like gender roles, and we know that a lot of the ways that women have been treated throughout history have been really artificial. There's nothing natural that says that women can't do a lot of the jobs that they've been denied up to this point in history. And then you can follow that up with the character of Emily Grierson illustrates the devastation that can occur when individuals are denied control over their own existence. Now, all these seem like pretty negative types of things, but, A Rose for Emily is a pretty negative story. Some pretty horrible things happen. So, what is I hesitate to say the lesson that we can learn from this, but it really is kind of, the story of what can happen and why those things happen. All right, let's move on to some different ways we can approach a literary analysis. Now, one of the most common ways is with literary devices. So you're taking a look at some of the literary terms that you've learned throughout high school and into college, and these are sort of the building blocks of good literature. And one of the things we don't want to do with literary devices is to just say, okay, we're going to focus in this story, we're going to focus on symbolism, but we want to say symbolism to do what? For what purpose? William Faulkner uses symbolism to expose the hypocrisy of the code of the Old South or something like that. So you don't want to just say, Faulkner uses imagery and just say, here's some imagery, here's another example of imagery, here's another example of imagery, because by the time you get to the end of your paper, you're going to be wondering, okay, so what? Yeah, he uses this imagery. Now what am I supposed to do with it? Your reader's thinking the same thing. So you want to say that, how does that setting function in the story, and how does it help William Faulkner accomplish his goal? So you can pick any of these literary devices or any combination of the literary devices, but what is the effect, or how does it contribute to the theme or the overall effect of the story? Okay, and keep in mind, I kind of skipped over this part. You don't want to just pick one of these. I mean, you could if you wanted to, but don't feel like you're limiting yourself to, just one of these. They do cross over. There's a lot of middle ground there. Another thing you could do with the literary analysis is to show how the story you're dealing with exemplifies a particular literary genre. And in this case, we could take a look at, and we'll look at that a little bit later, that the genre of that A Rose for Emily exemplifies is the Southern Gothic. And there are lots of different elements of Southern Gothic, so you can kind of start off by explaining what that is, and point out lots of the different elements of William Faulkner's story and how it exemplifies that genre, and maybe even bring in some other stories that are also Gothic types of stories. Another approach you can take is a historical approach. A lot of times especially if we're young and we haven't studied a lot of history, we may tend to judge a character's motivations based on our own sort of 21st century experience and wonder, well, why didn't the character just do this? Well, if it's the 1800s and you're wondering, why did the character not just pull out his cell phone and, call 911, then, we're taking things out of historical context. So that's kind of a silly example, but a lot of times if we know something about the historical context of the setting in which the story takes place, you can learn a lot about why things happened, or why characters did what they did, or made the choices that they made. All right, the another one is a feminist perspective. So you could do a feminist interpretation of the story. In other words, what you're doing there is just discussing how the story illustrates the role of women in a given society. You could certainly do that with A Rose for Emily. She is obviously a female, but a female in a particular society. She was, she's not referred to as a woman. She's referred to as a lady. So it's not just the fact that she's a female, the fact that she's a female who lives within a particular element of society. And we don't want to assume that just because Emily is a woman that she was made to stay home and cook and clean all day, because Emily was a very genteel Southern belle, and she did not cook, she did not clean, she did not get her hands dirty. So be really careful about to get your facts straight with that. A Marxist interpretation or focus on an analysis discusses economic and social class elements, and how the story A Rose for Emily kind of reveals a lot about the social structures, the economics that went on in in the 1870s on into the 1930s, and how that might have affected Emily's situation. And of course, we know that the South after the Civil War, a lot of the aristocratic classes were built on the backs of slavery, and of course the oppression of African Americans and other minorities, later on in history. And so all of that has to do with social class. It has to do with the economic structure, and what is it about that sort of creates this decay and craziness that goes on in A Rose for Emily. One of my favorites, though, is a Freudian analysis, and it pretty much has to do with the psychoanalysis of the main character. And sorry, this is covered up over here, but the motivation, why do characters do what they do? And essentially, we have to ask the question, it's natural at the end of A Rose for Emily to ask the question, why does Emily kill Homer, and why does she sleep next to his dead body for all these years? What would motivate somebody to do that? Now, you could just dismiss the whole thing and say, well, the lady's crazy. She's just crazy. That's all there is to it. But that's really not being responsible. Just to write somebody off as crazy. It's kind of our responsibility as critically thinking human beings to try to understand why things happen, rather than just using dismissive language like that. So I think that psychoanalysis really does that. The Freudian interpretation. Why might the character do what she does? She's not just crazy. Nobody's just crazy. There are causes for every effect. And keep in mind, these are definitely not the only approaches to literary analysis. There are multiple literary analysis and a whole science of literary criticism. So again, this is the starter kit right here. So just some choices that we have at our disposal. All right, so let's take a look at this. This is a little bit about the Freudian analysis. Why does Emily kill Homer and sleep next to his dead body? Well, these are just a few examples of things you might come up with, and of course you'd have to have some textual evidence to back that up. But Emily has a controlling father. The guy doesn't even let her go on dates, even when she's on into her 30s and so on. And so she really has no idea about what real romantic relationships are all about. She's completely dysfunctional. Homer's the closest thing to romance she's ever experienced. She doesn't really know how to handle all that. And so when she feels that he's about to leave her, she's going to do what she does, and that is to hang on to whatever she can by whatever means necessary. We know that Homer he's a northerner, and he Emily back in the old days probably would never been allowed to have anything to do with a northerner, but he kind of reminds her of her father. He's strong and he's in control. He's the foreman, right? So he's got some authority, some power, and so Emily is attracted to him. And we see the foreshadowing with what she does with with her father's body, and how she holds on to the body rather than letting it go. So we can see that that's ultimately what happens to Homer as well. This next one is a quote. We remembered all the young men her father had driven away, and we knew with nothing left she would have to cling to that which robbed her as people will. And I like this phrase at the end, as people will. This is the narrator speaking in this case, but when he says as people will, he's saying this is what people do. When and this explains a lot of abusive types of situations. When for some strange reason, when people are abused, sometimes they identify with their abuser. Sometimes they have a strong affection in that regard. Or there's the syndrome, the people falling in love with their kidnapper and things like that. Well, he may be abusive, but he's all Emily knows. And so that's why she has this really kind of dysfunctional, twisted relationship with her father. So the next possibility, because she's a static character, Emily believes she can stop time. Emily has already kind of lost her mind by this point. She's already created a reality inside her home. She's already decided that what's going on outside her home is not for her. She can't function in that reality. So she's a static character. She believes she can stop time, and if she just uses her imagination a little bit, she kills Homer. She can imagine that they're slow dancing and doing all the things that married people do. All right, let's move on here. Everything and everyone that has had meaning has disappeared from Emily's life. She's desperate to hold on to her last hope of human connection, as twisted and bizarre as it is. And so, yeah, we've already kind of covered that last one, so we won't belabor that one too much. But you could come up with all kinds of different ideas about why Homer or why Emily would do such a thing as to kill this guy and to sleep next to his dead body for multiple years. All right, so that might be just a taste of what something might look like if it's a Freudian analysis. Let's move on to, we talked about the literary terms, and one of the literary terms that this story really lends itself to is the analysis of symbols. And first of all, we need to make sure we understand what the definition of symbol is. It is a concrete object or design that represents an abstract concept in literature. So we have to be careful to understand what the words concrete and abstract mean. Concrete means physical. It means tangible. You can hold it in your hand. You can experience it with your senses. Abstract is a concept. It's not a physical object. It's not something you can touch or feel. A concept like freedom. You can't carry around a bucket full of freedom. And A Rose for Emily is, it's full of symbols, but let's try to avoid a pitfall that a lot of people get into, and that is they will say things like, well, Emily's house is a symbol for Emily. Well, that can't be if we know the true definition of a symbol, because Emily's house is a concrete object. Emily is a concrete object. A concrete object cannot symbolize another concrete object. It has to symbolize an abstract concept. What we can do, though, is to take a look at Emily's house and Emily as two concrete objects, but they both are symbols for the same thing. And that abstract concept has to do with the Old South. Emily and her house both are sort of the last vestiges of that old Southern gentility and aristocracy and slave-based economy. And it's just, it just won't go away. It's that last little thing that reminds us of some sordid past. And so those things both are symbols for that particular thing, but they don't symbolize each other. So make sure we get our language correct. We're going to talk about some of these other symbols, but there's a tableau in the story, and we'll get more into that in a little bit. Emily is described as a monument. So, as opposed to being a human being, she's just sort of a reminder of a bygone era. There's the invisible watch, which really isn't invisible. It's just tucked inside Emily's, her clothing. And this occurs when the men come to collect her taxes, and she says, well, I don't have any taxes in Jefferson, because she's living in the past and assuming that, because Colonel Sartoris decided to absolve her of her taxes, that she doesn't have to pay taxes anymore. But that watch she has tucked away is kind of a nice symbol to indicate that Emily's denying the passage of time. It's a watch. It's a clear symbol of time, but the fact that it's hidden away, and the fact that you can't see it, but you can hear it ticking, indicates that Emily's denying that time is passing. But we can't really stop the passage of time. The apron that we see now, that's a symbol. We know that Colonel Sartoris is he's kind of an interesting character. He's the guy who really symbolizes that code of the Old South. He when he's introduced, he is introduced as the guy who fathered the edict that no Negro women shall appear in public without an apron. Well, what a horrible thing to do to African American women, to make them wear aprons in public as a symbol of their, as if to say, this is your lot in life, is to serve women like Emily. And that's all you're good for. That's all you'll ever be. And we're going to remind you of that by making you wear this symbol of oppression. We have black and white in the story. If you notice, Emily is often depicted, and if you kind of follow the timeline of the story, Emily is depicted as a slender lady dressed in white. But after Homer's death, she's depicted in a very different way. She's dressed in black, and she's plump, and she's even described as obese. And there's some interesting, if you trace that whole line there, it's really interesting how she transforms from before Homer's death to after Homer's death. And there have been even some critics who've said that, the imagery suggests that perhaps Emily has devoured Homer in some way, not really literally cannibalized him, but has sort of devoured him and fed off of his misfortune. The calligraphy, not a super important symbol, but this is what Southern belles did. If they weren't cooking and cleaning, if they weren't working, if they, what were they doing all day long? Southern belles were going to finishing school, charm school, whatever you want to call it. They were learning how to write pretty handwriting. That's what calligraphy is. Ornate, decorative handwriting. And everything about Emily is about decoration. It's about outward appearances. Her house is described in a way that is very decorative and ornate, and it's almost like a wedding cake with all kinds of, foo-foo decorations everywhere. But not very functional. If you put Emily on a deserted island, she'd probably starve to death in just a day or two, because she has no real functional survival skills. But the calligraphy, the china painting, this is another thing that Southern belles would do to bide their time during the day. They would do some knitting and some needlepoint and planning for the next party and that sort of thing, but really nothing very functional. And then we have the rose in the title, A Rose for Emily, and that could be a lot of things, but we do know that a rose often is a symbol for a lot of different things. Sometimes it symbolizes love. Well, there is this sort of corrupt version of love that Emily expresses in the story. We know that a rose is very beautiful, but only for a very short time, and then it withers away, it crumbles away, so it's often a symbol for the transient nature of physical beauty. A rose also is a tribute, so perhaps this is William Faulkner's tribute to Emily, his rose for Emily, and not just a rose for Emily, but a rose for all the Southern belles, all the women who were sort of tricked into believing that they were royalty, only to have the rug pulled out from under them and have to survive or not survive. There's another character who reminds me a lot of Emily. You may be familiar with Blanche Dubois in A Streetcar Named Desire, the faded Southern belle. She's trying to function after all the money's gone, after the mansion has gone away. How does she survive? Another not quite so important symbol is just the numbers that Emily refuses to have put on her house. Major theme in the story is Emily's refusal to let go of the past, and to the point where she won't even let the Postal Service put numbers on the outside of her house, because that was something that occurred after her father's death. And then, of course, Colonel Sartoris, being a human symbol for the Old South. He's the guy who understands Emily. He makes up the lie that her father donated money, and therefore that's why she doesn't have to pay taxes in Jefferson. And you see Colonel Sargeras also being the guy who upholds that code of the Old South that says, as much as we lift ladies like Emily up on a pedestal and treat them like they're some kind of royalty, we're also going to downgrade African American women. And there's something just fundamentally wrong about that. So Colonel Sargeras is a symbol of that old time social structure. All right, so let's take a look at Emily and her house. If you're going to do this analysis on symbolism, you would probably want to use this quote. This might be something that you would want to use as your textual evidence. And look at the description of the house. It was a big, squarish frame house that had once been white, decorated with cupolas and spires and scrolled balconies in the heavily lightsome style of the 70s. So, these are all the decorative types of things. A lot like Emily herself, very much a sort of a human ornament, a decoration, not much functionality. Set on what had once been our most select street, but now this thing that was, used to house sort of aristocracy is now surrounded by garages, cotton gins, and so forth. This is the New South. This is the, rather than the economy being based on slavery, now they're using machines. And that's what the garages and the cotton gins and the gas pumps and all this sort of thing are all about. Miss Emily's house was left lifting its stubborn and coquettish decay above the cotton wagons and the gas pumps, an eyesore among eyesores. A lot like Emily herself, something that used to be grand and glorious, and now it's just sort of a sad, depressing symbol of what used to be. And even the use of the word coquettish, if you look up, what the word coquette means, it means kind of a bashful, shy, flirtatious young lady. The kind of language you would use to describe a Southern belle, but it's being used to describe the house. So a little bit of interesting commentary there. The tableau is another really important symbol. Now, keep in mind that this tableau doesn't really exist. It's a figure of speech. The townsperson who's narrating the story says that we often thought of them as a tableau. So this is not like a picture that's hanging up in the house or anything. It's really an illustration of the relationship between Emily and her father. So none of the young men were quite good enough for Emily and such. We had long thought of them as a tableau. Miss Emily, a slender figure in white in the background, her father, a spraddled silhouette in the foreground, his back to her and clutching a horsewhip, the two of them framed by the back-flung door. So when she got to be 30 and was still single, we were not pleased exactly, but vindicated. Even with insanity in the family, she wouldn't have turned down all of her chances if they had really materialized. Now, if you think about this tableau, and you can read this section here, you can pause the video if you'd like, but I'm just going to give you a little bit of a rundown here. So we have Emily, the slender figure dressed in white, and she's standing in the background in a very subservient kind of a position. We have her father spraddled with his feet apart, and he's holding a horsewhip, this symbol of oppression and symbol of, what he's going to fight off her suitors with. And she's standing sort of meekly and mildly against the back-flung door. It's almost like the doors opened up just long enough to let Emily come out and pose for the picture, and then she goes right back inside. So her father's kept her cooped up like a caged animal her whole life. But then we get into this last part where it says that she was, when she was 30 and she still wasn't married, is dad still not letting her date when she's 30 years old? There's something really kind of twisted and bizarre about that, which, in the true Southern Gothic style, or just Gothic style, a lot of times there is some suggestion of incest perhaps going on here. And Emily's father, why would he not let his grown daughter date men and do things that other women do? It just seems really bizarre and twisted. And if you think of other Gothic stories like Edgar Allan Poe's Fall of the House of Usher, there is definitely some suggestions of incest going on there, much more strong than what we see in A Rose for Emily. But it's a possibility that we have to think about. All right, let's move on to, if you wanted to do your paper about how A Rose for Emily exemplifies a lot of the components of the Southern Gothic genre. You could find a lot of those, and well, here they are. I mean, the ruins of a castle or a manor house. There's almost always a big, scary building that is about to crumble, and again, follow the House of Usher, the house in A Rose for Emily. This thing that's, was once grand and glorious, and now it's just about to cave in. We see in a lot of Edgar Allan Poe stories, right? Family secrets, secret rooms, a misunderstood character. Now, that's something that we have to be careful about. Gothic does not mean anything that's scary. A lot of people like to refer to any scary stuff, any Halloween types of things, or slasher movies and things like that as Gothic, and they're really not. The Gothic involves something a little more profound than just people killing each other. The main character in a Gothic story is misunderstood. So whereas we might have a character like Freddy Krueger who's just out killing people just for the sake of killing them, we don't really identify with him at all. But we do identify with Emily. We do understand maybe why she would do the crazy things she does with Homer and so on. We know she's a victim of her own circumstance, and we don't forgive her act of murder, but at least we can understand it and empathize with her in some way. Frankenstein, we've got the stories down here. Frankenstein, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. The character he's a killer. He does, he kills people. He does horrible things, but you have to know the backstory behind why he does what he does. Edward Scissorhands, if you're familiar with that movie. Sling Blade, another great Southern Gothic story. Even Boo Radley from To Kill a Mockingbird he's a Southern Gothic character, although To Kill a Mockingbird doesn't really qualify as a Southern Gothic story. The character of Boo Radley certainly does, because he's scary, he's isolated, he is, we empathize with him. He's a misunderstood character. He's really, what Atticus says is, he's the mockingbird that the kids should stay away from. He's misunderstood. He's not scary, he is dangerous to the wrong kinds of people. Just like Roderick Usher is dangerous to the wrong kinds of people. And Frankenstein, the creature, not the doctor, but the creature is dangerous to the wrong kinds of people. And we don't normally think of benevolence, pity, and friendship when it comes to scary movies, but with Gothic stories, that's an essential element. We do empathize with that character, because we see that the character is mistreated, is misunderstood, and it says a lot about human nature and human psychology. So let's move on to the last thing here, and that is that literary analysis can include many things. It can be you can take a lot of different approaches. You can take the approach here, or you can, there are lots of other sources for how to do a literary analysis. But the important thing is to choose a focus and stick with it. Don't just say a little bit about this and a little bit about that, and just kind of lose your focus and just pick some really cool things about the story that you want to tell people who don't know. But we do want to choose that focus and stay with it, and choose a line of thought, and establish our thesis and move on. All right, very good. That's the end of our literary analysis discussion. Hopefully that helps. And let's get moving with A Rose for Emily, and this will get us started with our discussion. So good luck with your writing.